Good evening, or afternoon, or morning for everyone out there in our Zoom nation. I'm Mabel Wilson, and I am the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, as well as a professor in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Columbia University. The university is built on the traditional land and unceded territory of the Munsee Lenape, and I pay respect to their diaspora and honor the past, present, and future rights and presence of the Lenape on their homeland. For the past 29 years, the Institute for Research in African American Studies, IRAAS, founded by the late Professor Manning Marable, has been a fierce advocate of social responsibility in Black studies. Dr. Marable offered a prescient reminder in a New York Times article from 1998 that, quote, Black studies must utilize history and culture as tools by which an oppressed people can transform their lives and the entire society. Scholars have an obligation not to just interpret, but to act, end quote. The Institute serves as an academic resource center for a local and global community that has cultivated an intellectual tradition grounded in Harlem and New York City's rich history and culture. Now, in partnership with our Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, what we call AAAADS, has joined IRAAS to continue to expand the array of contemporary scholarship and interpretation of the Black diasporic experience. With this year's art history lectures co-sponsored with the Department of Art History and Archaeology here at Columbia University. And so we are pleased to welcome Dr. Samantha Noël of Wayne State University to today's Art History AAADS talk. Dr. Noël is an associate professor of art history and the Hawkins Ferry Endowed Chair in Modern and Contemporary Art at Wayne State University. She received her BA in Fine Arts from Brooklyn College, C.U.N.Y, and her MA and Ph.D in art history from Duke University. Noël's book, Tropical Aesthetics of Black Modernism, Duke University Press, published fairly recently in February of 2021, investigates how Caribbean and American modern artists responded to colonial and hegemonic regimes through visual and performative tropicalist representation. Her talk this evening is titled Tropical Modernisms, the Black Geographies of Wifredo Lam and Josephine Baker. Moderating the question and answers will be my colleague, Dr. Kelly Jones, who is the Hans Hofmann Professor of Modern Art and the Chair of African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Columbia University. Dr. Jones's accomplishments are many, including being named a MacArthur Foundation Fellow, a Fellow of the Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a Fellow to the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. Of her many publications of note are two books published by Duke University, I Minded, Living and Writing Contemporary Arts of 2011, and South of Pico, African American Artists in Los Angeles in the 1960s and 70s from 2017, which was named a Best Art Book of 2017 by the New York Times. Her exhibition, Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980, at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, was named one of the best exhibitions in 2011 and 2012 by Art Forum. So we will have a Q&A period around 7 p.m. So that is Eastern Standard Time. So please leave your questions in the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar. And so now I am pleased to welcome Dr. Samantha Noël.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And yes, along with Dr. Mabel O. Wilson, I'd also like to thank Dr. Kelly Jones for inviting me to give this talk. And I'd also like to thank the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, as well as the Department of Art History and Archaeology. This talk seeks to illuminate the imaginative ways in which Black visual artists and performers of the Caribbean and the United States sought to create art that epitomized their respective milieus in the early 20th century. It is gleaned from my book, Tropical Aesthetics of Black Modernism, which contemplates in great depth on how early 20th century Caribbean and American artists responded to oppressive regimes through visual and corporeal expressions of tropicality. Moreover, this project privileges the land and reveals how Black diasporic artists recognized that a sense of place is critical to their creative processes, as well as in the identity formation of early 20th century Black people. While this book offers ideas about Black modernism that are new to the discipline of art history in particular, it is important to acknowledge its address to studies of Black modernity more broadly. By proposing an alternative understanding of the tropics, this talk shows how Wifredo Lam and Josephine Baker effectively contributed to the development of Black modernity and even Black sonic modernity. My theoretical intervention demonstrates how tropicality calls for a new understanding of the African diasporic experience, a unifying element connecting the Black Atlantic that is not generic, but creates a linkage between this enclave and the land of origin, Africa. This notion of tropicality thus disrupts the construction of Africa as the antithesis of Europe and the embodiment of the past, and renders the Pan-African world as a purposeful interlocutor of modern life. This project grapples with the ways in which visual tropes of tropicality complicated the conveyance of modernity for Black people in different locations throughout the Black Atlantic. It examines the creative manifestations of Black modernism in the early 20th century and explicates how tropicality functioned as a key unifying element in diasporic art. By examining the works of Lam and Baker in this talk, I will explicate how their representations of tropical and subtropical landscapes are reflective of the unique yet complex relationship that Black people of these respective regions have with the terrain they inhabit, land on which many of the enslaved ancestors labored. Despite this traumatic legacy, these creative works nonetheless show how this land is revered by its inhabitants, who recognize it for its beauty, with the intention not to transform it, but to accept it. This ideological heeding to nature should be viewed as an alternative modernity that counters the idea of transforming undeveloped nature for the sake of capitalist expansion. In doing so, there is a particular political enterprise at stake, one that dissociates the land with the history of slavery and thereby reclaims it. Artists such as Wifredo Lam and Josephine Baker are thus highlighting the internationalist ethos of Pan-Africanism through their visual and performed explorations of landscapes, terrains that are mostly tropical, and are therefore geopolitically uniting areas such as the southern United States and the Caribbean. Ultimately, this talk seeks to illuminate the desire for early 20th century Black Atlantic peoples to engender a sense of belonging to the citizenry and a particular kind of claim to the land that they inhabit, which speaks to a desire for home. In The Problem of Nature, David Arnold asserts that tropicality is a form of othering that encapsulates an ambivalent body of ideas, representations, and experiences, all of which exist in mental juxtaposition to something else. Or, simply stated, tropicality is a social construction rather than a material reality. Historically, when European and European American artists and writers who ventured to tropical zones represented these terrains, their perceptions of the physical arrangements were compounded by projections of values and ideals, as well as certain fears and prejudices. Historian Nancy Lees-Stepan reminds us that the word landscape refers to, quote, a manner of perceiving space in terms of a scene situated at a distance from the observer that is rooted in a Western way of organizing the visual field, and that the designation of a site as one of nature often results in our ignoring the social matrices that frame or produce it, or the realities and textures of human activities necessary to make it work as a site of nature, end quote. Indeed, this Western way of perceiving the natural environment of the global South began in the 15th century and persisted well into the 20th century. In his explication of the modernist experience, Edouard Glissant calls for alternative modernisms to be more collective and not singular in their rethinking of these narratives. And he encourages these constructions to embrace the complications that already exist. Quote, they must include all at once struggle, aggressiveness, belonging, lucidity, distrust of self, absolute love, contours of the landscape, emptiness of the cities, victories and confrontations. This is what I call our eruption into modernity, end quote. This line of inquiry speaks to the importance of recognizing a diversity of experiences in modernism, but in particular, the diverse experiences of Black modernism. As Glissant further elucidates, the human spirit yearns for a cross-cultural relationship without universalist transcendence. And diversity requires the presence of peoples with the intention of creating a new relationship. With this in mind, it is plausible to discern how early 20th century Black Atlantic artists defied conventional understandings of tropicalia by representing tropical terrains in art and performance in new and radical ways. In the vein of art historians such as Kabina Mercer, Laurie Stokes Sims argues that for Black artists, quote, modernism affirmed the notion that a modern individual could be an agent of change or transformation. Whereas for white artists, modernism was reflected in the breakdown of the representational and the familiar in literature and art. For Black artists, that rupture represented a potential revolution in self-definition and self-image, as they assumed the role of proactive rather than reactive agents in contemporary society, end quote. These artists employed what I call tropical aesthetics in an effort to enact the naming of place. Women's studies scholar Catherine McKittrick asserts that such naming, quote, regardless of expressive method and technique, is also a process of self-assertion and humanization, end quote. The tropical aesthetics of these artists and performers use function in this vein, proving to be an aesthetic that makes possible what McKittrick calls a sayability of geography that enables agency. There is no aspiration for material ownership and Black repossession, but what she terms a grammar of liberation. Tropical aesthetics thus allowed these artists to visually articulate a different way of knowing and imagining the world. Since geography in a material and discursive sense is never fully secure, given that three-dimensional space is socially produced, the idea that belonging to a place could lead to a socio-spatial liberation is seldom realized for many Black people. Due to these limitations, tropical aesthetics allows for a critical imaging and reclaiming of space. And through art, one can reify social geographies through the manifestation of what McKittrick calls alternative geographic formulations. Indeed, as the artists and performers explored in tropical aesthetics of Black modernism have proven, art can bring into fruition a different sense of place. In the first chapter of my book, I examined the work of artist Aaron Douglas. In this chapter, I argue that the compositions in which the natural landscapes predominate should not be viewed as a visual rebuttal of modernism, but rather as a Black modernist representation that emphasizes tropicalia as monumental and integral to early 20th century Black definition. The second chapter examines the ways in which Wifredo Lam and his art encompass the proactive and transformative nature of Black modernism, emphasizing the fundamental purpose of the terrain. The performance in early 20th century Trinidad Carnival is the focus of the third chapter, and it considers how carnivalesque revelry offered an immediate means through which the body, as a creative force, can readily accomplish a direct connection with the terrain and thereby enact a naming of place, therefore functioning as an articulation of Pan-Africanism. In the fourth chapter, I examine the ways in which the stage and screen performances of Josephine Baker and Maya Angelou served as an imperative of the modern era by transforming their predicament, not only through self-reinvention, but also through reorienting their relationship with the physical world. So now I'm going to move on to the Wifredo Lam section of the talk. Upon Wifredo Lam's return to Cuba in 1941, he became fully preoccupied with the dense natural wildlife of his country. Undoubtedly, it was the natural terrain that prevailed in much of the art he created while on the island. Lam's reinvention of the landscape in his compositions is part of a tradition of self-invention in the Caribbean and is central to a New World aesthetic. Ultimately, this propensity to invent a new landscape is in line with creating an empowering historical narrative. Through his art, Lam is re-signifying the tropical landscape as indicative of modernity, while also commemorating the connection that Black Cubans had with the land. In this section, I will reveal how Lam's reinvention of the landscape was ultimately a prelude to the self-definition Black Cubans and ultimately all Black Atlantic peoples aspire to have. I consider how tropical aesthetics can be a useful strategy employed by Lam to disrupt the touristic gaze, given its potential for inducing agency and imagining new possibilities for one's natural surroundings. In 1941, Lam began a journey that would eventually take him back to Cuba. When he was finally able to escape war-torn France, he and a group of friends boarded a ship bound for Martinique. During a 6-week stay, Lam befriended Aimé and Suzanne Césaire and René Ménil, who had just begun publishing the journal Tropique. Aimé Césaire returned to Martinique with his wife Suzanne in 1939 after pursuing their tertiary education in Paris, and they later launched the journal Tropique. The periodical tackled the history of slavery and the predicament of colonialism, and it often published articles in natural history, and the intention was to stimulate Antillians to revere their natural environment. For Aimé Césaire, the foundation of a newly defined Black Caribbean subjectivity is situated in the soil, the nucleus of the landscape. And the political and cultural and spiritual identity of modern Black people is inherently connected to vegetation. For Suzanne Césaire, the plant is the means through which humanity can be redeemed and empowered. In the Césairian ethos, the plant connotes an Africa-derived worldview in which man does not dominate nature, but rather abandons himself to the rhythm of universal life. These ideologies certainly encouraged Lam to rediscover his African ancestry once he returned to Cuba. However, Cuban society was generally dismissive of Black Cuban culture, and Black Cubans rarely spoke openly with whites about their African cultural heritage. Yet by the 1920s, the cultural sphere became exemplified by a group of Cuban intellectuals who promoted Afro-Cubanismo as a defining force for Cuban national identity. Cuban modernists championed the Black Cuban masses, as well as their creative forms that lay outside the usual academic and elitist purview. However, their affirming ideologies did not overshadow the social, political, and economical predicament Black Cubans experienced in their everyday lives. And this reality was troubling to Lam and gave him much fodder for his artistic mission. For the artist, returning to Cuba was like returning to his beginnings. With a rapid increase in Cuba's population, the mostly American-owned sugar industry, and the collapse of the world sugar prices had a devastating effect on its citizens who had to contend with the uncertainty of unemployment and underemployment. As a Cuban of African as well as Chinese and Spanish descent, the debilitating poverty of Black Cubans most certainly was of major significance to Lam. It was therefore imperative that his art became a political weapon that visualized the plight of a subaltern people. The jungle ultimately served that purpose. It is a visually rich composition featuring a tapestry of thick tropical foliage, notably sugarcane stalks, tobacco leaves, and palm leaves. The greenery depicted by Lam has a striking and animated presence, and its depth and varying textures clearly parallels the imagery seen in the photographs of Lam's garden, which was a major source of inspiration. The composition defies the Renaissance notion of linear perspective, offering a visual realm that, according to Laurie Stokes Sims, parallels the all-over paintings of the 1950s New York, where, quote, the sense of a centralized focus was eliminated in favor of an equal distribution of parts to the overall whole, end quote. Emanating from the foliage of 4 anthropomorphic beings, their linear frames echo the verticality of the cane stalks, and their coloring allows for a camouflage effect. Yet their mask-like faces, large bulbous breasts and buttocks, which resemble fruits like papaya, not to mention their large feet and hands, render them as quite distinct. Some arms are outstretched, others akimbo, while the arm of the second figure from the left reaches down, oh dear, to the ground like a foot. The overlapping forms and amalgams of body parts are configured via cubist pictorial arrangements and multiple viewpoints, while the transgression against naturalist representations is certainly an adherence to the surrealist liberties that Lam employed. Art historian Julia P. Herzberg notes that Lam began merging the figure with the landscape just before he painted the jungle. Prior to that, there was a fusing of the human form with an array of zoological elements, most notably parts of the horse's body. By 1942, there was a rapid progression in unifying his anthropomorphic forms with leaves and eventually with dense vegetation. One of the many references inherent in the jungle that makes it distinct from other Cuban works is the veneration of Afro-Cuban religion. The figures in the painting can be interpreted as what art historian Edward Lucy Smith describes as a Santeria procession. Santeria is a syncretic religion of Cuba that combines both Yoruba religious ideologies and Roman Catholicism. In the jungle, Santeria deities meander through and blend with the tall stalks of sugarcane and tobacco leaves. In fact, Lam was the first modern artist in Cuba to visually explore African-derived religion in art. Another Black religious form of Cuba, called Palomonte, is also thematically relevant to the composition. Dense, untilled botanical areas, the monte, where religious ceremonies take place, are often considered to be sacred. It is believed that Orishas, the Yoruba deities of the Santeria religion, are invoked in these spaces, thereby allowing the sacred to come into the space. This is also the site where the priests and priestesses gather necessary plants for rites that support the well-being of their devotees. Palo Monte is even more significant here, particularly since the word monte is included in its name, and monte is the sacred space. Related to religious practices from the pre-colonial kingdom of Congo in Central Africa, the word palo means a segment of wood, while monte refers to a forested area that is sacred, as well as a rural stronghold. Lam astutely captured the sacredness of the landscape with his rich and selective color palette. Another characteristic that makes the jungle viscerally in tandem with the African continuum that exists in Cuba is the masquerade-like qualities endemic in the anthropomorphic forms. Their bodies seem to slither through the cane and tobacco-filled terrain, and their placement in the foreground is commanding in such a way that recalls revelers asserting themselves in the public sphere during one of Cuba's masquerading traditions. Structurally, the jungle echoes Federico Mial's Day of the Magi of 1853, with its vibrant and masquerading figures occupying the foreground, most notably the 6 figures at the very front. At best, the collective emergence of Lam's figures from the vegetation encourages one to think of the transgressive possibilities of the carnivalesque and the eminence of this cultural form to people of African descent in Cuba. This transgression permeates through the monumental anthropomorphic figures that crowd the foreground, creating spatial tension. There is also a great sense of dynamism in the push and pull effect of the large forms, given the large feet and hands that press downward and push upward, generating a sense of movement in different directions that is pervasive in the gaiety of carnival. Such spatial tension generated from every section of the composition, along with the representation of crops associated with slavery and colonialism, signify a horrid legacy of exploitation and oppression. Yet it also highlights the counter-histories of resistance and revival embedded in the counter-ideologies of Black Cuban culture. In keeping with this idea of subversion, the jungle articulates a political imperative. Lam is clearly making a choice to feature the landscape rather than the urbanity found in many of Cuba's metropolitan centers. He explained the painting was intended to communicate a psychic state. Lam expressed that he wanted to, quote, represent the spirit of the Negroes in the situation in which they are in. I have used poetry to show the reality of acceptance and protest, end quote. For him, the word jungle aptly captured this reality. Etymologically, the word jungle was adapted from the Sanskrit word jangala in an effort to convey environmental differences between Europe and tropical localities. Jangala, which is translated to mean tangled thicket, was gradually distorted from its original culturally specific meaning as it pertained to India and the tropical landscapes of India. But by 1813, it became jangle, which was defined as a wood or thicket, a country overrun with wood or long grass in a rude and uncultivated state. Eventually, jangle became jungle, which denoted the dense, tangled, and menacing vegetation representative of tropical nature that stood in stark contrast to the orderliness of temperate woodlands. Jungle as a construct thus became universalized to signify all dense forests of the tropical world and augmented the established notion that a lack of organization and coherence in the physical environment is directly connected to a lack of organization and coherence amongst its inhabitants. Lam was keenly aware of this signification and of how the word connoted a place of threats, of aggressions, of perils known and unknown. He also recognized how relevant this word was during this historical moment when Cuban artists and writers acknowledged the landscape along with the mulata, as a symbol of cultural nationalism. Yet, although there is no jungle in Cuba, as Lam rightly stated, but rather woods, hills, and open country, the artist's decision to use the word jungle to epitomize the current state of affairs for Afro-Cubans is clever, since he is usurping a Western construct of the tropics in a satirical way to visually convey a socioeconomic predicament of Black Cubans that was the result of Western institutions of slavery and colonialism. But it should be noted that his friend, the anthropologist Lydia Cabrera, she often titled much of the works that he created in Cuba. So there may have been some collaboration as well with the titling of these works. So such an employment of the term is astute, as it also provides complex commentary on the Western construct of the tropicality and its association with the Black body. Using the aesthetic rubric of modernism, Lam's art makes it possible for the viewer to recognize the ways in which the Black masses relate to their environment. Through the practice of a gram of liberation, Lam's art allows for the naming of place that makes self-assertion and self-definition possible. Lam's signature piece commemorates the many challenges Black Cubans endured up until the artist's return. The jungle celebrates their perseverance while simultaneously rejecting any pretense as to who the land belongs to, serving as a gesture of reclamation for land that was mostly owned by American companies and used for the capitalist prosperity of the US. Undoubtedly, this painting encompasses the revolutionary spirit of Black modernism, given Lam's bold reinterpretation of the Cuban landscape, while also emphasizing the resolute character of the Black masses. Okay, so now we're moving on to the Josephine Baker section. Integral to understanding the ways in which tropical aesthetics are present in exoticized performances of the early 20th century is the consideration of how corporeal expressions of Black performers are enduringly connected to the making of space and claiming a kind of geographic sovereignty. Much in the same way cabarets and music halls incorporated jungle decor into their furnishings to invoke the primitive, I argue in this section that Black performers in turn exploited the tropical artifice to ritualistically engender a likeness to Black autonomy on stage or in song. This speaks to an association of the tropics with a homeland to which one belongs. Indeed, how one experiences race and space in the modern world is negotiated by bodies in motion. And in the early 20th century, as Jana Brown asserts, quote, dance was the lexicon reflecting the dialectic process of modern transformation, the modern body continually reinventing itself in and against its environment, at the same time as the environment made its claims upon the body, end quote. Through song and dance, Black performers practice an imperative of the modern era by transforming their predicament not only through self-reinvention, but also through reorienting their relationship with the physical world. The defiant dancing and singing body worked to challenge geographies of domination and its eclipsing of Black women's geographies, functioning against a world that regarded Black populations as ungeographic. This is evident in the acts of Josephine Baker. In particular, it resonates in her performances of the famed La Revue Nègre at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, and later in La Folie du Jour at the Folies Bergère, both in 1920s Paris. Yet, the performances were meant to cater to the escapist desires of the sophisticated Parisian that were deep-rooted in colonialist and exoticist indoctrination. These productions followed the precedent of popular shows featured in the cabarets and nightclubs of early 20th century New York. Baker was discovered by the creator of La Revue Negre, Carolyn Dudley Reagan, in one such venue, the Plantation Club of Midtown Manhattan. Frequented by after-theater members of the Cafe Society, like the Cotton Club in Harlem, the Plantation Club bore a name that intimated the antebellum South. The owners intended for the power structure of that era to be replicated with carefree Black employees catering to every need of the white patrons. Like the featured performances, the decor incorporated furnishings that invoked the primitive and was often referred to as jungle decor. The Cotton Club, for instance, had artificial palm trees, a plantation facade, while the elegant furniture, fixtures, draperies, and tablecloths were reminiscent of the big house on a southern plantation. Explicitly imbricated in these environments are the impressions of transatlantic slavery, which leak into the future, in essence, recycling the displacement of difference. While these environments draw from traditional geographic arrangements, one can see how the cabarets and later the music halls of Paris not only simulated the social and racial order of slavery, but also implicated the geography, landscape, and spatial arrangements essential for the institution of slavery. Premiering in 1925 with 25 musicians and artists, La Revue Negre aspired to become the first major vaudeville-style production that truly represented Black expressive cultures around the world, with a lineup that included a melange of cultural offerings ranging from the Dixieland music of the American South to an authentic African performance titled Danse des Sauvages. The intent was to feature a bill that incorporated the many cultural manifestations attributed to Black people. The review consisted of 7 acts: Mississippi Steamboat Race, New York Skyscraper, Louisiana Camp Meeting, Les Strutting Babies, Darky Impressions, Les Pieds qui Parlent, and Charleston Cabaret. And each act stereotypically highlighted a trait often associated with the soul of Black people: idleness, melancholy, religious fervor, and sexual ecstasy. Particularly interesting is the invocation of locality in the names of most of the 7 acts. They are named after places like Louisiana and Charleston that have long histories of slavery and colonialist oppression. And more importantly, in locations that are situated within the tropical and subtropical zones of the world. The set designs, costuming, musical accompaniment, and choreography of the performances all worked in concert to illuminate the supposed inherent linkage between Black bodies and the tropical zone. It is clear in the conceptualization of the review that the idea of the tropics serves to conjure a hot zone, referring to climate, character, sexuality, and even food, which would consolidate the borders of Europeanness and whiteness. The costuming evoked visual markers that codify Black bodies as destitute, indolent, and even impulsive, highly sexual, and exoticized beings. Such a tropical-inspired sensibility characterized the jungle-themed jazz performances one would have seen at the clubs, cabarets, and music halls of 1920s Harlem. The Black Mecca of New York became the site of glamorized otherness, where white patrons went to experience the easily exploited fantasy of tropical sensuality and savage release. White trade clubs such as the Plantation Club, the Cotton Club, and Connie's Inn, located in a strip in Harlem, apart from the Plantation Club in Midtown Manhattan, eventually garnered the name Jungle Alley, offering an opportunity to experience an iteration of the jungle without losing white civility. Carolyn Dudley Reagan, the creator of the review, would have been well aware of this trend and would have played a key role in incorporating the concept into La Revue Neg, thereby being instrumental in exporting this cultural phenomenon to Europe. The notion of the tropics as a hot and torrid zone is what the Parisian audience reacted to upon seeing Josephine Baker and Jo Alex perform their act Danse des Sauvages in La Revue Neg. The review's choreographer decided that this nude performance by Josephine would give the production the erotic edge it needed at a climactic moment, and Baker conceded to this request. The sexually charged performance closed the show and featured Baker and Alex in revealing costumes, with Baker wearing a feather miniskirt and feathers on her wrists and ankles. The dance gave emphasis to the hypersexualization prescribed to Black people, with the conveyance of tropical Africa in the various elements of the production, all serving to strengthen this representation. The performance consisted of acrobatic bodily movements with the accompaniment of a polyrhythmic arrangement by the drummer. There were also corporeal expressions akin to the belly dance that featured moves such as the shake, the shimmy, and the mess around, popular dances of the jazz age in 1920s New York. All in all, it is impossible not to recognize the allusions to the jungle that characterize the conceptualization of Blackness in the Western imaginary of the early 20th century. And Baker's contrasting public image off the stage undoubtedly signifies an embodiment of Black modernity. And when she incorporated the opposing sides of her image into her act, this thwarted any possibilities of audience misconceptions. Remnants of her offstage persona are evident on the cover of the La Folie du Jour album of 1926. A gleaming Baker is pictured with her hair coiffed in her signature hairstyle and decked in chandelier earrings, an elaborate pearl necklace, and bracelets. While she is bare-chested, which is typical of Folie Bergère female performance of the time, her costume primarily consists of large aqua blue feather plumes. This image captures the Black modernity inherent in her oeuvre. Not to mention, it exhibits how adept she was in fitting the calculated incongruity between her two sides into her act to maximize its exposure. Since the enterprise of constructing Baker's imagery as a tropicalized other was rooted in a specific geographic location, which is entrenched in France's long-standing involvement in slavery and colonialism, costumes such as the famed banana skirt certainly emblematized tropicality. Originally conceived by the French writers Jean Cocteau and Paul Colin, Baker first wore the skirt early in her career, starting in the production La Folie du Jour in 1926, and appeared in other iterations of it over the next 10 years. Folie Bergère offered its patrons escapist spectacles deeply ensconced in Orientalist forms of exotica, and the lavish extravaganzas were accented by extravagant decor of North African derivation that included luxuriant green plants and even a Turkish bath. The set design for La Folie du Jour consisted of a dramatic view of thick tropical foliage with a large uprooted tree overrun with vines and moss taking up much of the middle ground as it is lying on its side. A small portrayal of Baker can be seen playfully running along the tree's trunk, but also trying to avoid falling into the body of water that flows beneath it. Just along the top foreground of the image are detailed renderings of leaves and of various tropical plants, conveyed in such a way so as to extend the facsimile of Tropicalia onto the stage. The tone of the colors is quite dark, and it mirrors the dark colors used to render the other human figures depicted in the lower foreground of the image. 7 figures could be seen either sitting or reclining on the ground, 6 of them of African descent looking straight toward the viewer, while the lone white male figure wearing a pith helmet appears to be sleeping in a makeshift open tent. This vista not only exemplifies French colonial conquest in Africa, but it also characterizes the future colonial subjects as complicit to this colonialist project. The jungle spectacle of La Folie du Jour began with 2 black male drummers decked in loincloths, positioned underneath a palm tree. While beating their drums, Baker slowly reveals each limb and eventually her torso as she descends from a tree. She then proceeds to present her erotic repertoire of movements in a performance that actively engages with the backdrop discussed earlier. In the second act, she wore gold bracelets, beaded necklaces, and a collection of realistic-looking bananas fastened around a waistband. She then performed popular dances like the Charleston and the Black Bottom. The emphasis, however, lay on undulating pelvic movements, and as Baker explained, the banana skirt, quote, slung low around my hips to accentuate my forward and backward movements, end quote. Although the multiple phalli of the skirt at once signify the dichotomy of the effeminization of the Black male through castration, and alternatively his inherent hypermasculinization, her performance successfully emphasizes an appropriation of masculinity while also challenging heteronormativity. One can even recognize the artistic cannibalism inherent in Baker's performance. In addition, Baker's Black body, accentuated by the banana skirt, provides an example of the tropics biting back, so the disruption of the power dynamics at play. Rather than accept the pejorative value assigned to tropicality by European thought, tropical aesthetics allows us to think differently about how Baker exercised artistic cannibalism in an effort to consume reductive significations, such as disparaging the tropical landscape and its association with the fetishized Black body. Her performances could be viewed as fully engaged in recontextualizing these values in a way that is transformative, since it turns the colonial and imperialist logic of the fetishized Black body on its head. Furthermore, when considering the set design for La Folie du Jour, one can acknowledge how this replicated terrain conjures the idea of Africa as a homeland that connected Black people of all nationalities, like those living in Paris, and signifies the possibility of Black sovereignty. This surreptitious ode to Africa reinstates the truth that all African-descended people in and out of the continent persistently engage in modern life. The popular dances Baker sampled during her performances proved to be just as effective in demystifying the Black body's relation with tropical and subtropical landscapes. Most, if not all, of the popular dances that Baker appropriated in her performance were rooted in the long-standing tradition during the 18th and 19th centuries of enslaved African Americans parodying the music and dancing of their white masters. An immensely popular dance in France, the cakewalk was originally a plantation harvest dance that combined the European quadrille with strutting imitations of the planters class. The Charleston lampooned the square dances of the planters class, in addition to Africanizing and reconceptualizing the quadrille. What is fascinating about this early 20th century popular dance is that it is named after a city that was the epicenter for the American institution of slavery. As literary scholar Michael Boshuk argues, in the spirit of enslaved people parodying the dances and actions of their masters, the Charleston does not highlight the failure for the Black performer to emulate the innate grace of whites, but rather the performer's movements instead exaggerate white sophistication itself as affected instead of inherent, end quote. Josephine Baker continued this tradition in her performances by expanding on the parodying of white affectations that ultimately called into question the notion of white superiority. Indeed, the transformation of the French music hall into the ungeographic domain of the jungle via the sound of jazz music, the jungle imagery of the set design, and the frenzied dancing of Black performers all worked in concert to bring into fruition the world of mythic Black primitivism. Every night, the Music Hall des Champs-Élysées essentially became a simulated version of the imagined primitivist Africa and the Southern United States. There is something carnivalesque and parodying about these jungle spectacles, especially since Paris was a Black trans nation all its own. While performers adhered to the desired misrepresentations of Blackness that the white audiences wanted to see, after curtain call, they would go to neighborhoods like Montmartre and Montparnasse, where Black modernity was fully practiced and embodied. By the 1920s, the number of Black entertainers traveling from the US increased significantly, and there were also many performers coming from the Caribbean, Latin America, and continental Africa. Through his restructuring of modernist aesthetics in his own terms, Wifredo Lam became an insistent and persevering force within the Western art world, thereby transforming the canon into one that is global. His art conjured a world that was decidedly Caribbean, using the Western pictorial tradition as a point of departure. His art pursued the Herculean endeavor of galvanizing the Black masses of the Caribbean to what the idea of belonging to a place is based on a struggle for socio-spatial liberation. The pursuit of this venture is often never fully realized, yet the art of Wifredo Lam offers alternative geographic formulations, a particular rendering of a different sense of place. Similarly, to ritualize embodiments of tropicalia, Josephine Baker's dynamic and provocative bodily expressions generated the symbolic sovereignty of Pan-Africa, an affinity many early 20th century Blacks necessitated. Indeed, Baker performed constructions of Blackness and Black otherness that she did not ultimately control. Such conundrums in the experiences of early 20th century Black performers are constant reminders that, as Stephanie Lee Batiste asserts, quote, ideologies of power rooted in hierarchy and racism can at times coexist with agendas to assert racial equality and Black humanity, even as the very terms of representations insist upon the opposite, end quote. Ultimately, shifts inevitably occurred in the way Black people molded their identities, insisting that one developed a strong sense of place in this endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Noël, for that wonderful talk. It was fantastic. And we do have, yes, we're seeing all the applause coming up. We do have one question to start with, and I have a couple of more. And let's start. It's an incredibly long question from somebody, Alu Gressau Gambrel. I don't know if you know the person. And here's the question. I am interested in the tensions between Professor Noël's work and the claims made by Alain Locke in his work concerning the Black artist, in which he draws or claims a rupture between African populations and those of the diaspora as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. The difference and power of Professor Noël's work is, I believe, found in her ability to orient a diasporic tradition with relation to the African context. My question concerns this connection in a singular Black gaze. How might Professor Noël's work make an important intervention in landscape and bodily depictions in the diaspora and their recovery of Africa as anti-colonial, anti-geographies. Are these, as Dr. Noël puts it, inherent ungeographies? Might these make the familiar presence of landscapes in Haitian and Jamaican paintings in diaspora homes radical disruptions of space through art? What an inspiring engagement. So there you have it.
Yeah, well, that's you know, wonderful, I think, like ideas being presented here, and great questions, a lot of questions. I'm glad that I'm seeing it in black and white so I could like focus on, yeah. Okay, so the connection in a singular Black gaze, yeah, how might the ones would make an important intervention? Okay. Well, I mean, I think, you know, I believe, I hope my book, you know, certainly tries to, you know, attempts or succeeds in making interventions within, with regards to the Black body, and, you know, an attempt to reclaim, right, and assert some sense of belonging to the landscape. But yeah, I mean, I really am also, you know, very much engaged, and was even in the midst of writing and, you know, developing my ideas for this book, very curious about that very romantic and utopic association that diasporic peoples often made with continental Africa, because, you know, it certainly was, you know, that particular conceptualization of Africa was, you know, a source of hope and possibility, you know, even with regards to Black political autonomy. When we think of, for example, the efforts of Marcus Garvey and his U.N.Y, right, and the Black Star Line, and right, and even, you know, other attempts too in other parts of the Americas, when we think, for example, of the ending of slavery in the U.S. and you know, discussions about Black colonies in places like Central America and so forth, right? But you know, given the, you know, perception of the spaces that Black people occupied, right, in the early 20th century throughout the Black Atlantic as being ungeographic, because they were, to use the words of McKittrick, these traditional geographic arrangements, right? You know, I think it really is through performance, be it on stage or even, you know, the you know, what M. Nobas Phillips refers to as you know, the, if you will, like the ultimate, like, Caribbean aesthetic being performance, right? But performance like in the public sphere during you know, various carnival and festival traditions that happens, you know, throughout the Caribbean, you know, but even also, you know, in the southern US, you know, if we think, for example, places like New Orleans, right, during Mardi Gras, or even when Junkanoo was practiced, you know, in the southeastern US, right? These were opportunities and important interventions, I think, in, you know, a kind of performative, ritualized means of belonging, right? And then we have these artistic interventions as well that really insert and in an interesting way, like, yeah, envisage and envision, right, a different, a new, optimistic, hopeful association and connection that Black people have with the land, right? This, this, you know, these imagined possibilities. So, and, you know, to speak to, yeah, when you mentioned, might these make a familiar presence of landscapes and, like, for example, Haitian or Jamaican paintings and diaspora homes. Yeah, I mean, I think there are, you know, like you mentioned in that question, Aliu, you know, there are disruptions of space, and there are ways in which I think, you know, particularly during this time period in the early 20th century, right, when there were these efforts to challenge Jim Crow, to challenge colonialism and these oppressive, you know, institutionalized forms of oppression, right? I think art made, you know, was one of the ways in which, artists, and particularly artists like, for example, thinking about Aaron Douglas, right, in the US, Wifredo Lam in Cuba. These were some of the ways in which they could truly make manifest, right, the hopes and the the pillars, the tenets, the aspirations of the Pan-Africanism movement, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the important contributions and efforts of creative people who were also very much active in terms of various political and social movements as they existed in their respective localities, right? So I hope that answers your question. It was very multifaceted, but I think it does cover some things, so.
Our next question is from Eric Mazariegos, who says, thank you for your fantastic talk. I wonder if you can speak to the broader traditions of Cuban artists, specifically their relationship to land and landscapes. I'm thinking of, for example, Tania Bruguera and Amendieta's performances dealing with issues of land, earth, and places of origin. Do you think Lam is doing something similar or different? Or do you think a focus on landscapes and materials like vegetation formulated distinct Afro-Caribbean aesthetic experience?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Eric. And I'm trying to remember specifically Tania Bruguera's work, and I'm trying to think of, because both of them, Ana Mendieta definitely does these performances, right, and Bruguera as well, but I know she does it. In the case of Bruguera, she works in built as well as natural environments, but Mendieta's I know are specifically in the natural landscape, because she is dealing with issues of her traumatic childhood and themes of exile and so forth. And so I think there are definitely interesting intersections and parallels that could be made with these artists, these more contemporary artists, when we compare their works with Lam. So I think there definitely are some similarities with regards to like reclamation and not feeling like you entirely belong to the land, and certainly like the citizenry, or even with regards to Bruguera, right, and her her social practice art, right, that's really concerned with like the civil rights of Cubans. So I think there are really interesting like parallels and similarities, but and certainly Mendieta's work was in many ways deeply influenced by Black Cuban religious traditions and spiritual ideologies. And so in many ways, there are interesting similarities, but in terms of differences, I do think there are like some immense differences, because Lam, well, first of all, being male and returning after a kind of, I suppose, a form of self-induced exile. He was in Europe for I think about 12 years or so before he returned to Cuba. And so he was responding to what the situation that existed, as it existed in Cuba, during the World War II years, right? And what he witnessed with regards to the exploitation of the land by the American companies, and the fact that, in Cuba, because there was such a large presence, a significant presence, particularly in the urban areas, right, of Americans who came for work, but also for pleasure as well, right, the casinos and so forth, right? There was this kind of informal, but an eventual and gradual kind of imposition of Jim Crow like practices and tendencies with regards to segregation and racial discrimination. And so Black Cubans had to endure that and deal with that, and so it was very particular to what was happening in Cuba at that time, and with it being not, just, some decades after the ending of slavery. So it was like a different time period, a different context with regards to the Cuban society, and it was also pre-revolutionary Cuba, so it was very different. So I think that in a number of ways the works of Lam during his Cuban years definitely differ to Mendieta's and Bruguera. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I have a couple of questions too, but I'll go back to Baker and then get to Lam. I think one of the things that I find fascinating about your arguments with Baker that I find to be new is this idea of her use of the carnivalesque and really pushing on that, and how she mobilized that idea. You talk about in the book ideas of sovereignty that she mobilizes, and also freedom, and as a way to get to humanity. And I wonder if you can talk about, put all those 4 words together, carnivalesque, sovereignty, freedom, and humanity, because I think the kind of general reading of Baker would not be that. I mean, yes, we know, of course, later, and she's a spy, and she, has just recently been buried in a very public burial as a freedom fighter, and we know that about her. But I think in this time period you're talking about, the very early, 1925, we wouldn't really see all those other things. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about how the carnivalesque relates to those other ideas, which we really kind of relate to, maybe her service, to the nation, the kind of heroic ideas in certain ways.
Yeah, that's a really great question, because I was really purposeful in wanting to anchor a lot of my ideas and themes explored in that chapter with yes, it has to do with like the Black body and modernity, but I think particularly with regards to the performances, and well, at least it's the Josephine Baker section of that chapter, right? I felt it was really important to situate it within the context of the antebellum South, of slavery, right? Thinking about like the furnishings and the decor and these and these like the Cotton Club and the Plantation Club and so forth, because they're so very interconnected. And when we think of the lineage of Black American dance, at least in terms of how it existed in the early 20th century, right? It was so very clear to me when reading about early 20th century Black American dance forms, right? That there was this deep connection to the carnivalist aspects of creative expression, bodily expression of enslaved African Americans that had to be done, they had to be very clever in how they were satirizing, parodying their masters, right? And there's something, deeply carnivalesque about that, because even when we think about, parts of the Black Atlantic where festival traditions were, like sustained, of course they were very syncretic and very much creolized, right? There was also this huge, immense element of parody and satire, because, Carnival makes that possible. And I think, that's one of the ways in which enslaved Africans in the US were able to embody and to bring into fruition these forms of critique and very low frequency forms of rebellion, right? And so I really think that a lot, much of the dance and the various performances that we see in early 20th century in the vaudeville stage in the US, and in turn in cities like Paris, it very much is like a progression and, you know, a more 20th century modern iteration of what was expressed, prior to the ending of slavery, right? And you know, once again, I'm thinking of this in very broad terms geographically, not only with regards to the US. And so, yeah, and so, you know, with this in mind, you know, thinking about the fact that during this time period, you know, to be a Black person in the Black Atlantic, one wasn't only necessarily thinking about one's particular situation in, you know, St. Louis or Detroit or Charleston, right? But because of the vibrancy of the Pan-Africanism movement, one was also aware of what was happening in other parts of the Black Atlantic as well. So, you know, you know, in cities like New York, in cities like Paris, right? You know, the Black, you know, Pan-Africa was, you know, was very much alive because of the migration, not only of people from the, you know, southern US with regards to New York, but also immigrants coming from the Caribbean and from Africa as well into, you know, via Ellis Island into New York City and then other parts of the US. And, you know, the case in Paris as well, you know, and I think it's important when we talk about early 20th century Black life, we have to think about it in diasporic terms, because the possibility of ending various forms of repression in one's particular like country or colony during that time, that was the ultimate hope. But Black people were thinking more globally. And so, and I think I'm saying all that to say that's why I was thinking about when talking about and when trying to explicate and unpack and theorize what Josephine Baker was doing on the stage. I really was very much thinking in these broad terms with regards to Black Atlantic creative expression, but particularly as it pertains to the body, because I think much of it was rooted in, that was one of the few means through which Black people could have expressed themselves, right? If they couldn't say it, they would embody it, right? And they, even, despite being on the vaudeville stage in blackface or having to like do those kinds of performances that Josephine Baker had to do, they found ways to assert their humanity and to assert their Black subjectivity, and even boldly to what I perceive, right, kind of suggest, insinuate possibilities of Black autonomy, political autonomy, creative autonomy. So I think, and I don't know if that anything that I said just made sense, but I think in those ways, the carnivalesque and sovereignty, and I forgot the other words that you mentioned, but
freedom was the other.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in those ways, carnival does allow for like a momentary freedom, but I think, when we think about in sort of like en masse, this large collective of people like on the streets or on the natural terrain, but even in other moments, like on the stage, right? Or in everyday, like, like small quotidian sort of like encounters or lived experiences. I think, those were ways in which Black people could experience that sense of freedom as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can I ask one last question, which is about the jungle? You touched on that with Lam, La Ungla, and always love that painting. And I teaching it also, his words about he wanted his art to be the Trojan horse that like gets in there and then jumps out and starts the revolution.
Mm.
But I looked up, it's painted between 42 and 44, I think you say. By 45, it's in MoMA.
Yeah.
Right? It's already at the Museum of Modern Art. It's already, as John Yao says, please wait by the coat room, in his, classic article about where that painting ends up. So I wonder, is that him being the Trojan horse? But it as much as he was trying to intervene, as you discussed, in the lives of Afro-Cubans, I mean, what happens to that spirit if it's in MoMA by the coat room? I mean, I don't know if in 1945 it's even out. I mean, of course, we know, of course, this is the moment when Rockefeller's buying all this, during World War II, because they can't get to Europe. So they're buying this Latin American stuff. But I wonder if that kind of shifts, the wonderfulness we see in the jungle, of course, the scissors as the machete, it has all these connotations that you also talk about with the bodies and really thinking about it as a landscape painting. But I'm wondering if that is foreclosed or not, if it's like almost immediately seems to go right to MoMA.
Wow, you're blowing my mind right now. Like, why didn't I think of that when I was writing the book? Wow, that is like my mind is literally blown right now. But yeah, that's a really, really, really profound question. Yeah, does it lose its power if its efficacy, its agency, right? Because I mean, we know that he did have these representation by these galleries. I mean, he definitely was trying to be part of, right, this this ever-changing and evolving, particularly at this particular time with World War II, participate in the art market, and he was eager certainly to have his work be part of collections of private collectors, museums, and so forth. So yeah, I mean, I think it's it is a good question, you're right, because one wonders, yeah, if it even was out in the galleries when he first sold it to when it was first accessioned by MoMA. And so yeah, I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, I'm really gonna have to I'm gonna be dreaming about that question and thinking about it for like an entire week. But yeah, I mean, one wonders, if and especially with what the people would have seen and how they would perceive his work, and even the title of it, because it's such like a tricky thing, because I mean, it's so easy to consume the image and the title as being, oh yeah, it's just he's representing what, the Caribbean jungle, the African jungle, with some with some savagery kind of mixed up in there. I mean, I could only imagine what people of that time period would have thought when they saw it. And so that there is that larger question of visual literacy, and even like cultural literacy as well. Like, would they have been like culturally aware, right, of the significance of like Afro-Cuban religions, and what the role of American corporations in Cuba at that time? Like, would they have been empathetic? Would it have enlightened them, open their eyes with regards to the plight of Black Cuban people, when they see that? Because yeah, one has to wonder if, being in an art institution like MoMA, if it loses its efficacy, if its power, right? So yeah, that's a really, really great question, and really is giving me a lot to think about as well.
Well, maybe it's still the Trojan horse. I mean, maybe he even,
yeah,
if he didn't anticipate it over the time, he lived for many years after that,
right,
he saw what would happen to it. But it still had that power, even if it was by the coat room. I remember going there as a young person interested in art, and always stopping there because I knew where it was.
yeah,
right, and always visiting that piece. So it's
same here.
And yes, and it's interesting, and I don't know if they would have seen it, but this is when we see Puerto Rican migration to New York, strengthening, shall we say. But again, we don't know if those people were going in MoMA, right? So, but it's interesting to see that somehow that dialogue. So maybe there's some kind of telepathic thing going on. Eventually it becomes the Trojan horse, and eventually it has its impact. So thank you so much for such a wonderful talk and a wonderful book. And I will turn it back over to my wonderful colleague, Mabel Wilson.
Yeah, no, thank you, Samantha. And I was going to say at the end, Kelly, I think it was a Trojan horse, precisely because the amount of, I remember that painting exactly from that essay, by the coat room. Yeah. And, the thing that it really spurred in terms of, understanding the ways in which certain artists were kind of left out of the main galleries and marginalized within the canons. And I think, that work certainly in my understanding of art history and modernism, that article about that painting was just absolutely mind-blowing and I think critical. So it did do that. It did do that work, actually. So I think there is one more question. Should we ask it, or it's just observations on Catherine Dunham? I don't know if you have anything quick to say about that for Mary Tooley Parker.
Yeah, I did consider looking at Catherine Dunham's work, particularly in connection to the performances by Josephine Baker. But I did not, I didn't venture that way. But let me I want to see the question again. I haven't really delved into the work of Catherine Dunham extensively, but I still do respect and admire what she did, particularly given her interest in Afro-Caribbean dance and recognizing, right, the expansive nature and the power of dance throughout the diaspora. But I haven't really investigated and done a lot of reading of her work or any work written about her. But I am definitely I do find her a very important figure, an admirable figure of that time period for sure.
Great, thank you so much for answering that last question. And Kelly and I really do want to thank you for your explorations of the geographies of sovereignty of Black Atlantic artists. And we've had, we just started a series called Black Countercartographies, and this kind of fits in absolutely perfectly with the conversations that we've been having about the ways in which, a kind of counter cartography, gets created in various ways, and particularly through the arts. And so I think this absolutely is responding to and contributing to those dialogues. So thank you. But I also want to say a special thanks to our dedicated colleague, Sharon Harris, who makes all of the webinar possible, and Sean Mendoza, who handles all of the business behind these talks. And I also just want to thank our IRAAS assistants, Olivia Pearson and Joss Ugabata, who were also essential in shaping tonight's events. So just want to share a little bit about what's upcoming for us. On Friday, October 14th, we will have the second in the Black Countercartography series, exploring Black geographies with scholar Janet Francis, University of Miami, and artist filmmaker Farron Humes. And so they will absolutely be in that kind of landscape of where the American South intersects with the Caribbean and Latin America. So I think it'll be an excellent, I think, follow-up to some of the thoughts that Samantha generously shared tonight, or this morning, Kelly, on Venetian time. I also want to say on Thursday, October 20th, we will have our, I think that's correct. We will have our second AAADS art history lecture by Dr. Rachel Grace Newman, and the title of her talk is Where the Sea Meets the Sky, Infinity. And lastly, please mark your calendars for a memorial celebration of the life and work of our colleague, Dr. Stephen Gregory, on November 18th at Faculty House. The gathering will also include an exhibitions of Stephen's extraordinary photographs, along with a number of his colleagues and former students sort of gathering to kind of reflect both on the impact of his work and, future work that actually is coming out posthumously. So for more information about this and other events, please see our website, afamstudies.columbia.edu. And so I want to thank our audience for your insightful questions and for attending tonight's talk. So please take care and be well. All right. Thanks so much, Samantha.
Thank you so
You.
much. Thank you.
All right.